Today, I'm ready to get started on that Ancient Pottery Challenge by making the Encinas Red on Brown bowl. If you don't know what the Ancient Pottery Challenge is, it's a group of 7 ancient pots that I've selected to recreate on my channel this season. And you can make the same pots if you want and upload them to Instagram with the hashtag Ancient Pottery Challenge, and I will share your creation here on this channel. If you're interested in learning more about the Ancient Pottery Challenge, I've got a link to that video explaining what it is down in the doobly-doo. I understand that this bowl might not be the most impressive pot in that collection of 7, but it has a very impressive story. Now, in the ancient one, a lot of the designs have worn off from use, but I have an illustration that an archaeologist made showing what the design would look like in its entirety, and I'm going to use that as my example to make this bowl like it was when it was new, when it was a lot more impressive to look at. This brown clay I'm using comes from very near where that Pinaleño cotton cache was found. So it's really the appropriate clay for this project. Beyond that, it fires to just the perfect brown color for Encinas Red on Brown. Now, one of the things I hear from people a lot is, they've collected some wild clay and they're having problems with it. And one of the problems I hear a lot about is that it's cracking or it's not very plastic. And you can see with this clay, it's cracking quite a bit. And you saw that piece that fell off. Even if they're not very plastic or they have other problems, they're often very forgiving. So I was able to take that piece that came off and just stick it back on without any problems. So sometimes I advise people when they're talking about their clay and they say it has problems is find another clay. But sometimes the clay has useful properties as well. And this clay, I really love the texture of it. It's buttery smooth. It's really nice and soft, easy to sculpt. So I use it despite the lack of plasticity, of the weakness in it, which you saw as I was making that slab. So I start out with a slab, and it's really hard to make a slab big enough for a pookie this size. So the original ancient pot I'm recreating has a size of like 13.7 inches, I think, something like that. So I'm trying to make this bowl somewhere over 14 inches in diameter so it'll shrink down and be about the right size, 13.5 inches roughly. This is a big over 12-inch size pookie that I'm using here. Making a slab that size is pretty darn hard. So some people say, Andy, you should get a slab roller. A friend of mine told me that recently. And I don't feel like I need a slab roller. I certainly don't feel like the ancient potters felt like they needed a slab roller. They certainly didn't have one. They didn't even use rolling pins. So I'm good with the way I make slabs. And yeah, I can't make a huge slab and stick it in here, but honestly, with the plasticity of this clay, if I made a slab that big, I probably couldn't get it in there without it falling apart anyway. So it's not that big of a deal. So I started with a slab, and then I just keep rolling out coils and adding to it until I get it all filled in. And then when I'm done, I'll flip this over and work on the bottom to make sure I get all those seams where those coils were attached taken care of. So now I just need to let this rest for a little while and firm up so I can flip it upside down and work on the bottom. Now I use a piece of plywood here in order to flip this bowl upside down and work on the bottom. I promise this is the only unauthentic tool I use to make this bowl. But tell me in the comments how you think the ancient potters would have flipped this bowl upside down to work on the bottom at this stage without damaging it. I think they could have possibly used like a blanket or a piece of cloth if they had 2, 3, 4 people to kind of hold the corners. But I don't know, maybe they wouldn't have worked on the bottom until later, but I really felt like it was helpful to work on the bottom at this stage. Now this pookie has a dent in it. It has a funny dent in one spot, which means when you put it back in the pookie, you have to line it up correctly, or you're probably going to mess up the bottom and possibly even cause it to crack. So I spend a great deal of time trying to align it each time. This pookie is based on Michael Hawley's pookie, which was probably based on an ancient pot, which is probably where that dent came from. So now I'm ready to add my first coil. Roll out those coils with smooth, even, long strokes of your hand. I like to do a one-handed coil roll myself. And then we're going to attach this with a bonding pinch. Now usually I bond these on the outside of the pot, but in this case, right at the pookie line, there's no way for me to bond it there. So I'm going to bond it for this one coil on the inside of the pot, and then all the future ones will be done on the outside. Now you can see just how cracky this clay is. It really is lacking in plasticity quite a bit. But you can deal with that. And so if you watch this video, you will see how I deal with this clay that isn't very plastic. Just be careful, take your time, you'll get there. So once you've got the coil bonded, it's time to pinch it up, pinch the walls of the pot thinner, which is what I'm doing here. Now that seam on the outside, right at the pookie line, is going to be hard to deal with because I can't really deal with it at this stage very well. I can pinch into it a little bit, but for the most part, it's going to have to wait until this pot is completed being formed, has firmed up a little bit, and I can get it out of the pookie before I can deal with it. You'll notice that when I pinch those walls thinner, I pinch them mostly up, mostly in a vertical direction, which isn't really accurate for a rounded hemispherical bowl shape. It's not until I go to work with my gourd scraper on the inside that I work at shaping that bowl into the shape I want. So you see I have my hand on the outside of the pot, and I'm using that gourd scraper on the inside to give it the rounded shape I want. Now you have to be really careful here that you don't push beyond the edge of the pookie. Now before I add my next coil, I just want to make sure that the edge of the pot is rather even and level. That way it doesn't start getting all wonky and up and down too much. And then I'm also taking that wet gourd scraper and just kind of smoothing out places, especially places where that clay wants to crack. Because like I said, it is a little lacking in plasticity. So if it starts to crack, I'll just take that wet gourd and just kind of run it through there and recompress that clay so that it's nice and firm and all attached. I'm ready to add my coil. I don't have any underlying problems. And then I need to check the measurement. This bowl needs to be over 14 inches if it's going to shrink and still be the right size. So now I'm adding a second coil. I think it was a total of 3 coils on this bowl above the edge of the pookie. And of course, now I'm doing my bonding pinch on the outside, which is the usual way. Because of the way I attached that first coil at the edge of the pookie, I've got some pretty significant gaps in places right there at the pookie edge. So I'm just taking some little bits of damp clay and pressing them into that gap to kind of strengthen and build that up a little bit. Now, like I said, a lot of that is going to have to wait until I get it out of the pookie, but I want it to be as strong as possible. If you watched my last pot building video where I made the Dinwiddie bowl, you'll remember that the steps for coil building a pot that I laid out there were coil, bond, pinch, scrape the outside, scrape the inside, and repeat. Repeat as necessary until you reach the desired height. And now I'm ready to trim that rim down to a nice even level. When you're trimming the rim, it helps to kind of get down and eyeball it to make sure it's nice and level and even. Now after I've got the rim trimmed to where I want it, I get it nice and wet and sloppy. And then once it's all wet and kind of soft, I use a wet piece of buckskin to smooth it off and finish it. And that completes forming the pot. I'm ready to wrap it up and let it rest and come back and smooth it some more tomorrow. Today I have a lot of work to do scraping and smoothing the pot, getting it ready to be all finished and ready to be painted and dried. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use this deer rib just to scrape the outside smooth. That's going to get rid of any blemishes or inconsistencies in the pot wall. And now I need to flip it over again, and I need to pull the pookie off and work on the bottom. Because like I said, where I attached that first coil, there's a huge seam that never got dealt with. And there it is. So you can see I've got a lot of work to do around the edge of this pot, filling in that seam, but also scraping down that little ridge that exists right at the edge of the pookie. So I'm taking little bits of damp clay and just pressing them down into that little crack, making sure that's all filled with clay, and then using that damp deer rib just to scrape the ridge away and to scrape the whole bottom of the pot smooth and even. Now this won't give the pot a smooth texture. It'll be a little rough, but it'll have a smooth consistency, and we'll deal with the texture in a future step. Remember I told you there was a dent in the pookie? So here I am trying to figure out where the dent is in the pot so I can line it up with the dent in the pookie and get it all lined up so I can flip this thing over. It's a little bit of a challenge, and the pot is still soft enough that if I don't get the dent lined up, I could damage it. Smoothing the inside of the bowl is a little bit different. If you put a tool in there, you're likely to gouge it. Now, the rounded form of the gourd scraper could work, but sometimes just wet fingers is your best tool for smoothing the inside of a bowl. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm just using water and my fingers to just smooth and even out any little marks left by the gourd scraper. And then I'm going to let this dry until tomorrow. A lot of the steps in building a pot like this are dependent on different stages of dryness. And so now that it's firmed up to a certain point, I'm ready to begin stone smoothing. Now this isn't burnishing or polishing. This is not going to result in a glossy surface. This is just stone smoothing. It's like troweling concrete. I'm using a wet stone over the still damp surface of the pot to press in those bits of temper, press those down in, and to kind of bring to the surface those finer particles and make a nice, smooth, even surface that can take paint or slip or whatever I'm going to do to it. Here's how to make a quick and dirty slip out of your body clay. Just put some of the clay in a container, fill it up with water, and then mix it up really good. Once you've got it mixed up, you've got to let it sit and just settle for maybe a half hour to an hour. At that point, the larger particles are going to be at the bottom of the container. So you can just dip your paintbrush in and cake the slip right off the top. The fine material's all on the top. Just don't dip too deeply and you won't get any of the grit. So in this case, I'm going to put 2 thin coats of the body clay as a slip on the inside because the inside's going to get decorated. I don't want my temper showing through in the decorated area. Now, when I said that the plywood was the only modern piece I was going to use in recreating this pot, I guess I was wrong. I actually used this commercial brush. I didn't even think about it. I just grabbed it off my shelf and used it, so I apologize. Now here's the first of a couple of mistakes I made finishing off this bowl. And that is, I'm stone polishing the interior of the bowl. That is, making it smooth and a little glossy with a smooth stone. I just went ahead and did it because that's the way I usually work. And then I realized after I was done that the archaeological report indicates that the outside of the bowl was stone smooth, but the inside was not. So it's not a big deal. It's not a huge deal, but it shouldn't have been polished on the inside. It should have been matte on the inside. So be it. Finally, always leave your pots to dry upside down to prevent rim cracks. This bowl that I'm making is a replica of a bowl that was found high in a cave in the Pinaleño Mountains near Safford, Arizona in 1983. It had been placed upside down over the mouth of a large jar to protect the store of cotton inside from moisture and rodents. Archaeologists who examined this bowl identified it as a type they call Encinas Red on Brown. This type was made between about 950 and 1200 AD over most of southeastern Arizona. Encinas Red on Brown is a type of Mogollon brownware. In some ways, Mogollon brownware is the red-headed stepchild of prehistoric southwestern pottery. It doesn't get a lot of love, and you'd have trouble finding any museum that has it on display. But it is very important. Mogollon red on brown pottery types like this were the first of the decorated Mogollon types, and among the first decorated pottery in the entire Southwest. And although truly eye-catching examples of Mogollon red on brown are pretty hard to come by, this type, which sits at the root of Mogollon decorated pottery, later evolved into many beautiful and truly spectacular pottery types. Ancient pottery that can trace its roots back to Mogollon red on brown include such pottery types as Members black on white, Babu Kumari polychrome, Ramos polychrome, and even Maverick Mountain polychrome. So let's take a second to show some respect to those early Mogollon women who took time out of their truly busy lives to create red on brown pottery and therefore paved the way for later spectacular pottery types. And now for the painting. This is a mixture of red ochre mixed about 50% with red clay. And this is the yucca brush I'm going to use to paint this pot. I've got a video showing how to make yucca brushes. If you're interested in that, I'll put the link down in the doobly-doo. Now this is just a basic quartered design. Just cut the pot into 4, and then the spaces in between are filled in. Now, this is where I made the second and biggest of my mistakes finishing this pot. I got so involved in the spacing of lines that I got the overall layout wrong. So if you look at the picture of the original pot and then you look at mine, you'll see the design mistake. I won't point it out to you, but there are some mistakes in the way this was laid out. Overall, though, I think it came out really good. All right, it's finally firing day. So the first thing you need to do when you're firing outdoors like this is just preheat your pots. And that doesn't mean that you need to get them up to a certain temperature before you load them. It just means you're getting them warm and driving off any remaining moisture that might be in that clay, and that prevents a lot of breakage in this kind of firing. You'll see these rocks that I have up near the fire here. These are what we call kiln furniture. Those are just the rocks that I'm going to stack the pottery on top of over the coals. And so I'm preheating those too. This is really important, especially if you've had rain recently, to make sure that you don't have any wet rocks. The last time I fired in this location, I had one of those rocks explode and break a pot. So it's really smart to preheat your kiln furniture if you think those rocks might have moisture in them. And I'm just making sure these pots are all warm, kind of feeling them, see how warm they are. And if they're hot, then I'll rotate them so one of the cooler sides can get warmed. And then once the pottery is all preheated and that fire is burned down to coals, I need to move the pottery out of the way so that I can start kind of organizing things the way I want them for the firing. One thing you don't want to do is trip over a pot while you're doing this. So I'm just breaking up the coals and kind of building a nice bed, kind of spreading them out so that I can stack the pottery on top of that. And then there's the kiln furniture that's already been preheated, stacked there, and then the pots, of course, on top of that. So I put down this Mogollon wedding base. This is one we made in the Ancient Potters Club in November. This was our November project. And then I lean that Encinas Red on Brown bowl up against it. That way the inside of that bowl is up off the ground a little bit. We can get lots of airflow under there and oxidize that red paint nice and red. And so I lean that up against there. And here's where the first big accident of this firing happens, right here. Listen. You hear that? That was a chip breaking off the rim. And that happened because this clay doesn't have enough temper in it. And we'll find out more about that later on in the firing, but that was my first clue, that this clay doesn't have enough temper. That rapid heating from that part of the pot that was close to the coals caused a piece to break off. But, you know, what can you do? But restack the pottery and go ahead with the firing, which is what I did. And I didn't have any more of that sort of breakage in the rest of this firing. Now this is the same location where I did that firing with Chad Zuber, like back at the end of September. And I couldn't believe it, but nobody had taken all the excess wood we collected. It was still sitting there. So I'm carrying that wood down from up the way there and stacking it around the pottery and making a nice good stack, because my target here is about 800 to 850 degrees Celsius. Now, as I'm watching it burn, I'm watching for spots opening up, places where the fuel starts burning away, what I call windows, places where there's openings where cool air can get in. And when I see those, I'm putting extra fuel in there. So if you see me adding extra fuel to it, it's places where it's burning away too quickly, and I'm closing those windows. Because I want it all to burn the coals around the same time. And once it's down to this point and it's cooling off, I'm ready to kind of flip it over and let it cool a little more. Now, here's where the second problem from this firing happens. Listen. Do you hear that little tick, tick, tick? That is that Encinas bowl cracking as it cools. Another sign that there's not enough temper in that clay. All right, let's talk a little bit about this firing. This is that Mogollon wedding base I was making. Fired nice and hard. My temperatures got up well over 800 degrees, at least 820, something like that. So that was my target, was get over 800. So I'm happy with that.
As you can see, this came out really good. That little bowl, which was a test of some salt fluxes, that came out really good. I still have to get it home to see how those fluxes did. Now let's talk a little bit about that Encinas Red on Brown, because the results there were a little bit different than what we have here. This thing popped when I first put it into the fire. I could hear it snap, and I looked, and this piece had come out of the rim right here. And that's a sign right there that there's not enough temper for this clay. When it's heating up really fast and it just can't handle that thermal shock of the quick heat up, this was the part that was right down near the ground, almost on the coals. So this was heating up too quickly and it broke. Then when it was cooling down, there were a couple of cracks that developed. In fact, when I flipped it out of the fire, I could hear it like click, ting, 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 as it was cracking, sitting there cooling. Another sign there wasn't enough temper for this clay. Now, I used this clay a couple of times last year, never had any trouble with it with 20% temper. So I have to think maybe it's the size that I hadn't noticed it because I hadn't made any really large pottery. So I'm treating this bowl really delicately right now because I don't want it to do what that Tularosa bowl did and just fall apart. But overall, I'm happy with it. It came out nice. The designs are good. The colors are good. But it does have a number of cracks in it from not enough temper in the clay. This is a really good learning experience for the first pot of the Ancient Pottery Challenge for this season, because this is how it is. They don't always come out the way you expect. I made some mistakes when I laid out the design, and then some things happened in the firing, which couldn't have been prevented in the firing. They were caused by things that happened way back when I mixed up this clay. But it's a great example for you as you go about the Ancient Pottery Challenge this year to keep in mind that the stuff you make may not always come out perfect, but you need to be happy with what you get. Because I'm happy with this bowl. It's not the way I would have hoped it to be, but it certainly is a beautiful bowl, and it'll look good sitting around my house, and I might even sell it for a little bit. So I'm good with that. So I hope you consider participating in the Ancient Pottery Challenge this year. It's going to be a lot of fun. I've got 6 more beautiful pots to make. I'm going to try to do at least one a month. So look forward to that. Thanks for coming along with me today and following through the process. I expect to see your Encinas Red on Brown bowl on Instagram very soon. I'll catch you next time.